Thank you for joining me. I'm Gord Long. A reminder before we begin, do not trade from any of these slides. They are commentary for educational and discussion purposes only. Always consult a professional financial advisor before making any investment decisions. The purpose of the audio slides is to talk about the areas that are not updated in your monthly analytics and technical analysis report. This is based on our annual cycle as outlined on the subscriptions page on our site. We intentionally keep the technical analysis charts to the subscriber report so as not to confuse them with the drivers operating behind them. Drivers in the long term are primarily the fundamentals. In the intermediate term, they are about risk, and the short term is about confidence and sentiment. I'd like to complete our three-part series today, with this being part 3. As such, I would therefore like to cover the following subjects outlined here. In part 1 and 2, I focused on structural issues within the financial markets with specific emphasis on the equity market. As serious as the problems I outlined in part 1 and 2 are, they are basically reflective of how the system is being gamed. Like a casino, the financial markets attract all manner of personalities who have all sorts of devious ideas, both legal and illegal, with which to beat the system. Unfortunately, we're talking about the bedrock of the capitalist system here, not a playground for gamers. The financial markets are relied on to properly allocate precious capital in the most productive and efficient manner possible. Unfortunately, the massive and sophisticated gaming has been going on for such a long time now that it is only a matter of time before the growing distortions it has created will no doubt propagate an across-the-board systemic crisis. But it gets worse than what I outlined in the first two parts of this three-part series. The gaming extends out of Wall Street and into the real economy. The most blatant is how we measure, for example, economic growth, or what is referred to as GDP. This number is the basis for an infinite number of decisions that underpin daily our entire financial system. As you can see on the left, GDP has been steadily declining across the globe, and these are the official numbers from, in this case shown here, the OECD, but match those from the IMF, World Trade Organization, World Economic Forum, etc. This is a profound slowing, especially if factored against realistic numbers and not the bogus politically motivated adjustment numbers like the CPI. The Social Security pensioners out there will, I'm no doubt, attest to this. But again, it gets worse. Our 2017 thesis paper, The Illusion of Growth, lays this out in a 111-page document. I encourage you to scan it. If you haven't already, for non-subscribers, you can gain access to it through our free email service. We won't discuss the manipulative techniques of imputation, hedonic substitution at all today, but rather just one example of the degree of distortion. The GDP formula is from another era and is a mismatch in the context of today's fiat currency, fiscal stimulus, transfer payment, entitlement-based economies. Governments are now such a large part of most sovereign economies that they completely distort the formula. Government spending gets counted multiple times for multiple reasons. There is no netting that would bring it back closer in line with the measure of true productivity-centered economic growth. The green line shown here places this problem into perspective. The 2008 financial crisis was the point where the accumulation of all government money associated with government transfer payments and consumer credit actually overwhelmed the system. The numbers have only got worse since, and while programs such as QE and ZIRP have kept the economy afloat, irrelevant of the meaningless GDP number. As you are fully aware, this is not solely a U.S. problem, but rather a global problem, and it is why it took a global expansion of the money supply approaching $29 trillion to keep the global financial system afloat. We need to appreciate that all corporations and government revenues lead back to consumer consumption. In the case of the U.S. consumption, or the C in the GDP formula, it approximates 70% of our GDP. To sustain growth, U.S. corporations have therefore been aggressively pursuing the global consumer market for over 4 decades now. Lifting economies out of poverty and political headwinds, such as getting China to become a more consumer-centric economy, are daunting in themselves, but are seen to be required if we are going to keep global economic growth expanding faster than the real rate of inflation. But the glacial and stealth problem we tend to overlook is demographics. The consuming 24 to 55 age of the global population has actually peaked. This is more than a headwind. This is like pulling the rug out from under the economy, especially the economies addicted to expanding credit and debt to keep the growth charade alive. Last year, China's decade-old one-child policy kicked in. China's population growth has now gone negative. So where are all the consumers going to come from, and at the rate we have built a global financial infrastructure on? The world is certainly not coming to an end, but financial policies are going to be forced to change because of this, and that is the point we are leading to. We obviously need to ask, in what direction is that change likely to head? Additionally, I believe, as do others, the debt supercycle is ending. Look at any Kondratiev generational long wave and you can see it is overdue. We are likely at the midst of the final sugar high in public sentiment, ignited by unprecedented monetary policies, but as you can see from the downward sloping GDP line at the bottom, the inevitable lies ahead. My simplistic view of all of this is that it is like tossing a ball in the air. From your calculus classes, you'll recall that the distance, velocity, and acceleration experience different measures as the ball reaches its peak before falling back to Earth. What happens before we reach the peak is that acceleration becomes negative or experiences deceleration, while velocity starts to slow, but is still positive, and height, meanwhile, still shows growth. That is exactly what is happening with the official GDP measures. In reality, based on true growth, it is my opinion we are actually on the descending side of this illustration on the right. In 2014, I wrote another extensive thesis paper entitled The Globalization Trap. This 184-page document laid out in gory detail what was inevitably going to happen with advancing globalization. It would inevitably lead to hyperinflation and a liquidity trap due to impaired collateral and insufficient real wealth creation. I encourage you to also review this document if you haven't already. A core point of the document is that, ironically, real deflation will impair real disposable income. Global labor arbitrage will effectively kill the golden goose of high-earning economies and stall the debt-driven growth engine. That is where we are now. I don't believe I'm alone in this thinking. You can see that the global banks have been preparing for something which is clearly bothering them. Let's shift on the risks and problems out there and talk about what we are doing about them. Let's talk about global governance, a section we regularly post to in our macro research section on global risk. A central belief of our political leadership is that when the economy slows, then fiscal stimulus is the first order of the day. Government fiscal spending is the sole solution always, immediately resorted to. The consistent adoption of such policies has led to massive and growing fiscal deficits, negative current accounts, and historic levels of debt to GDP. Somehow, we always forget to pay back the debt-encumbered stimulus. You'd think that when you find yourself in such a deep hole, the first order of business would be to stop digging. Not the case. It is an excuse or perceived requirement to spend even more and at a faster rate. Well, the law of diminishing returns appears to be something that our politicians fail to study, the few that ever bothered with even a rudimentary Economics 101 course. Endless studies have proven that the bang for the buck for stimulus spending has been steadily falling. Some argue it actually went negative during the last financial crisis and is still negative. Even conservative economists agree it is now minimal compared to historical expectations. The velocity of money has also been steadily falling since the dot-com peak and fell below the long-term average going back to the 1900s during the 2008 financial crisis. Money is effectively now being consumed for things like debt versus moving through many hands, all participating in increasing productivity through capital investment. When money velocity is not increasing, then standards of living fall, and as a consequence, real disposable income also falls. This isn't rocket science, but appears to be something that is politically left untouched and out of the tightly controlled public narrative, like $84 trillion in unfunded U.S. entitlement programs and $400 trillion in global pension obligations out to 2050, and I could go on. As this chart illustrates, there are a raft of factors, all now contributing to slowing velocity of money. Few, if any, are being addressed, and as a matter of fact, all have forces on them to increase short-term pressures and thinking in the face of longer-term problem. Avoidance is the domain of politicians. They are about taking advantage of an inevitable crisis to achieve goals that otherwise wouldn't be achieved, like limiting Social Security and Medicare during the next crisis, or using it as an excuse for why spending must therefore be increased. The game is not new and actually can be seen in the study of cycles. I've done many under-the-lens videos on cycles, but as you can see here from one of the best cycles guys in the world, Harry Dent in my opinion, we have many of them, if not all, converging at this time. Sometime between now and 2022, almost all cycles I have studied are pointed downward within their various cycle frequencies. I refer you to the Under the Lens archive on our YouTube channel to explore more cycles than illustrated here. Politicians and government institutions are motivated for their own survival to maintain social stability and the status quo. No matter what, keep the system afloat, even if only temporarily, to buy more time. Just kick the can down the road. This is irresponsible, but is how our democratic system actually works and can be counted on not to change until a crisis is so large it gives a required political cover to implement long overdue changes. Governments are not managed like business. An effective politician is not a good businessman. They think differently. One is about perceptions, the other about reality. One is about fixing problems, the other is about avoiding them. For those who've studied management, they'll recognize the term country club managers. That is what politicians are. They actually wouldn't survive if they were different. Now we're getting to what lies ahead. Politicians will do what, and can be counted on to do what they have already been doing, even if it has failed, by doing even more of it, but at a faster and more aggressive rate. There are no new ideas even being proposed for many of the problems we previously discussed. None. Nada. We see social tensions everywhere, as I pointed out in this month's Global Risk, which we are now seeing global governments hurriedly heading in the fiscal direction of dramatically increasing military and defense procurement. Again, outlined within the Global Risk sections of our website. Current conditions are highly likely to simply continue in their deteriorating trajectories. This is where investing steps in. Take advantage of high probability, predictable outcomes. What is likely to break and create the next crisis, which we've been calling for a few years now, is the $550 trillion unregulated, over-the-counter, opaque global currency and interest swap scheme. Many of you will recall this grid which we put together at the time of the financial crisis in 2008 on what the unfolding sequence is highly likely to be. At this time we were in the upper left quadrant. We are now, after nearly a decade, in the bottom right quadrant. The governance answer to all this is going to be significantly advanced levels of financial repression. This is one of the reasons that years ago I co-founded the Financial Repression Authority, where we still have an active website with regular guest interviews. There are key pillars that the macroprudential strategy of financial repression is built on. It is well understood by central bankers and is a key quiver in their arsenal of solutions to keep governments solvent despite continuous failing fiscal policies. Never forget that the central banks, like the Federal Reserve, often answer to the banks and not the political apparatus. That is called separation of powers. When governments start spending even more excessively, and our current president has spent his career leveraging debt and even publicly considers himself the king of debt, you can expect the central bankers to soon go into overdrive in expanding the money supply. What we are highly likely to witness is advanced financial repression programs such as helicopter money to avoid the banking issues associated with collateral requirements, negative interest rates or NERP versus ZERP, which the EU already implemented with at 1.9 trillion of global debt being negative, guarantees to keep pensions and insurance companies from imploding, a tremendous potential problem that really makes everything I've said irrelevant, that guarantees are going to happen. The purchase of assets other than bonds to include the stock market, as Japan is already doing and other central banks, as for example Switzerland's central bank. The implementation of a cashless system to stop bank runs and bankruptcies and forced liquidity injections. It is my opinion, other than a few moments of market panic, the near to intermediate term future will see an accelerating Minsky melt-up in financial assets. They will print the money in the event of any and all financial problems as the only agreed-to expedient political solution to the problem du jour. This is stage 1, which we are presently in. Of course, this cannot last, and this is when we enter stage 2. This is when hyperinflation arrives, and we witness a global fiat currency crisis. It is still quite a few years ahead, so this is not your concern today, but you need to plan for it, or your retirement will not be a happy one. Remember, hyperinflation is a currency event, not an inflation event, though inflation goes through the roof and is what everyone believes is happening, while it is really about falling currency values. The thing to watch closely here for its advancement is the rate of U.S. de-dollarization. Our MATA SII de-dollarization tipping point tracks this with breaking news daily. Gold prices will also be another telltale sign to watch, but those days are still a ways away, and many gold bugs are highly likely to have finally thrown in the towel before stage 2 occurs. If they haven't, their profits will likely be confiscated in the form of predatory taxation. Stage 3 will be about a global realignment of the currency reserve currency. There are many possibilities here, depending which power has been most successful in surviving to that point. Right now, it looks like some form of the current IMF's SDR, that is special drawing rights, will be the surviving alternative, likely with some level of gold backing, even if it is minor. Everything I've talked about here in itself is another video, or has been a video or two previously. My intent, as I spelled out in the beginning of part 1, was to explain simply why I always end the videos with, "Don't worry, they will spend the money." This is what I mean. Knowing this defines your investment strategy for the foreseeable future and gives you a very clear North Star to guide your thinking. I'd like to take a moment as a reminder, do not trade from any of these slides. They are for educational and discussion purposes only. Thank you for listening. May 2018 be an outstanding investment year for you and your family. And I thank you very much for listening.